it's important to understand where freedom of religion comes from. In other words, what is the value that is at the root of freedom of religion, or any of the freedoms? Okay? So, in the secular world, the freedoms really emerge from the fact that the human being should be allowed to do what a human being wishes to do. Now, if you really think about it, what are the parameters upon what a human being can or can't do? What should be the basis of those parameters? You know, you wake up one day and say, "I'm alive," right? So why shouldn't you do? You want to follow, say from a Freudian perspective, you want to follow your id. So you want to do whatever you want to do. Why should you not follow whatever you want to do? Okay, that's the starting point of values, of understanding values. So what existed in Western Europe was the perception that human beings should not do what they want to do because human beings are animals. That is not their divine source. That's negative. Human beings should want to do. I'm talking from a Western perspective, a Christian perspective. Human beings should want to do what God wants them to do. That's really where the perception comes of the starting point of what we would call Christian values or whatever. You don't do what you want to do, okay? Because what you want to do is disgusting. It's like an animal. It's like physical, whatever. The perception from a religious perspective is you should do what God wants you to do, which is much more limited, much more narrow, and basically is contrary to what your natural interest would be. Okay, that would seem to be the perception, let's say, from a very base Christian perception, and this is found out in the ideas of the vows of celibacy, of poverty, and so forth. And sort of the issue of being selfish and the negativity of being selfish, which basically means you are taking activities for your own desires, right? Okay. So that's really what the world was in the 1700s. There was an authority, and the perception is what's value is you abiding by the authority, the ultimate authority being the divine. But this also carried down into societies. The value was following the king, and that's really where the concept of the divine right of king came from. The fact that this authority figure had the right to tell you what to do. And basically, what is perceived to be the good value is listening to the authority. That would seem to be what occurred in the early 1700s. The revolution that ensured, when you talk in terms of Rousseau or Voltaire or other people of that nature, and the whole philosophical world started going through this idea of, wait a sec, shouldn't human beings, why can't human beings simply do what they want to do? Is there a value in human beings simply doing what they want to do? And that's where you start getting the idea of the freedoms and the rights. Basically, it was all a revolution against authority. So you had the French Revolution, the American Revolution. These were all revolutions against authority. It was also the question of attacking the Catholic Church and challenging the Catholic Church, in the sense that the dominant value system was this authority, and what started developing was the idea of this challenge to the authority, and I should be allowed to do what I want to do. Okay, with the only caveat being the social contract. In other words, I should be allowed to do what I do as long as they don't hurt anyone else. And that became that became the expression of the freedoms. And then you see it in America: the right to bear arms, the right to do the right to do whatever you want to do, basically, as long as you don't hurt anyone else, as long as you don't challenge the society, right? Okay. Now, obviously, those freedoms that found the Declaration of Independence in America were not sacrosanct in this whole full extension of the ideas. Like, for example, there was a challenge in terms of slavery. All of a sudden, and there were people in the fathers you know, the drafters of what do you call them, the fathers, the fathers of independence, what do you call them, the founding fathers or whatever. There were arguments as well. This should also apply to the slaves and so forth and so forth. The fact is there was a perception that whites are better than blacks or whatever. But the point is that the starting point of I should be allowed to do what I want, and this constantly extended. So extended to the civil rights movement, extended to women's liberation. It's now extending into gay rights, right? Where basically the argument is, I want to do A, I'm not hurting anyone, why can't I be allowed to do A? Okay? And that seems to be where the whole movement comes from in terms of the freedoms. So, and the freedom, basically, a freedom of religion is you want to do what you want to do. You should be allowed to practice religion as you see it, without any authority figure telling you what you have to do. Okay, that would seem to be where the freedoms came from in Western society and further developed. In that extension, and this sort of developed through other developments in philosophy, came the idea that we don't really know truth anyways. See, the defense of authority is that somehow the authority has some right to tell you what to do, right? So the reason you follow God, divine, is because God is the creator, God is the sustainer, God has a right to tell you what to do, right? The point is, though, is authority has to be defended. Once you start challenging and saying, why should you have the authority, then you start challenging that whole authority aspect, therefore it limits the attack upon the freedoms. So what occurs, let's say, in the Tea Party, the original Boston Tea Party, where people basically said, why should the King of England tell us what to do? What's his authority? Okay, and they started saying that he shouldn't have authority. Okay, he shouldn't be. Where's the authority come from? Okay, does he protect us? I don't know. We can protect ourselves. Was there some reason of authority? Now, that really became the issue. And they basically said, listen, you don't have any right to have authority over us. And that was challenged by the whole concept of divine right of kings and the challenging of the right of authority. I mean, you saw this in the French Revolution and so forth. What right do you have authority over us? Okay, so that was always the battle, and as authority was challenged, then the right of individuals to express themselves was further developed. So this is constantly the battle that plays out in terms of the freedoms, where we limit any statements of authority against us. And in terms of, let's say, the religious parameters, we ask the question, how do we know it's true? Right? God says A. Well, how do I know God said it? And if you start developing ideas of relative morality, really what it comes down to is we don't really know what the truth is, and not only that, we can't even figure out what the truth is, then this doesn't become an authority figure anymore. Right? So God said to do this. How do I know God said to do this? Who says it's an authority figure? Right? So that's really where we are right now, and that's really what would practice freedom of religion. It basically said there's no authority, there's limitations on the authority figure to narrow what I am able to do. Okay, that's really the source of all freedoms. So on the surface, that would seem to be an issue in terms of Torah, because Torah is built upon an authority structure. Okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the creator of the world, has a sense of authority, has a right of authority. Right? So the question is, and this is a concept that's brought down in Meforshim as Melech Masava al Ha'am, that God has a right as king over the nation to set some parameters of authority. And that really is a perception, let's say, the Shem Mrs. B'nai Noach. That God, as an authority figure, says, hey, this is my world, these are the rules for following. You don't like it? Leave. Find another universe to go to. Okay? But the fact is that's an aspect of God having a right of authority. Now the question emerges, how does God have the right of authority? The values and issues of authority, but those are philosophical issues, but the bottom line is and that's usually what it turns out to. It's not just God as creator, it's God as sustainer. Since God is keeping you alive, He has certain rights of authority over you, right? Okay. But the point is that seems to be the classic religious structure. So religions generally create a concept of authority which challenges the freedoms. Okay, that you don't have a right to make every decision. There is an authority structure over your decision. So on the surface, it seems to be that Torah, abiding by an authority figure, or by rejecting the authority figure of Kodesh Baruch Hu, does limit our freedoms. Okay, and therefore says, listen, you don't have the right to do everything. Okay. So on the surface, there may be a disagreement between Torah and Western thought because of this completely different structure. The fact that we saw that certain people, that we saw positive attitudes towards the American experience where it did give us rights, tells us that we aren't so, that we actually like the fact that people gave us rights. We see some value in saying to people they have rights, right? That they have the right to make their own decision. So we seem to have some perception that being told that I can make my own decision is a good thing. I'm happy about that. And therefore, just by authority seems to be somewhat of an issue. Okay, so the point is, though, is that at the essence of the secular perception is the fact that we don't know truth. At the essence of the Torah perception is the fact that truth is knowable, right? Therefore, seems to be some defense of authority within the Torah perception. Okay, so the question comes down to is, does the Torah have any perception of giving a freedom to the individual to make their own decisions? So the fact is that there is there's an interesting Meshech Chachma, okay? And with this interesting Meshech Chachma, we begin to see a Torah distinctiveness in terms of the values of individuals. First of all, before I get to Meshech Chachma, let me point out one thing that's very significant. And that emerges from the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us responsibilities. So by giving us responsibilities, we actually earn Olam Haba. We are considered to earn our own way in the future world. That actually gives us a certain amount of distinctiveness. In Christianity, the idea that Jesus saves basically is man can't save himself. Man is too weak to save himself. He needs the Jesus figure to save him, which means man has no strength. Once you say to the human being that you can earn Olam Haba, we are giving the human being strength. And in giving the human being strength, you're giving him responsibility, you're giving him the right to make decisions, you're giving a certain authority over himself to him and her. Okay, so the individual is immediately looked upon from a Torah perspective as much more of a bar hachi. Okay, that he can be or she can be a decision maker and has some type of dominion over self. Okay, so that aspect of recognizing dominion over self, which is tied to Bechira and stuff like that, has a lot to do with the fact that you're beginning to recognize that a person has some control over their own being and has some power over their own destiny. It's not totally freedom, because the evaluation structure is the structure of the authority figure. In other words, here's the choice. Good and evil is still defined by the authority figure. But the point is I do believe in your strength as an individual in making those decisions. That already is a difference between Torah and some other religious perspectives. Okay. The point is, though, this Meshech Chachma is very interesting. The Meshech Chachma points out to the fact that in the statement given to Adam and Chava, the verse says, Mikol Eitz Hagan Ochel Tochel. That's in Bereshis, Perek Beis, Pasuk Tetzayin, Mikol Eitz Hagan Ochel Tochel. Now, if you look at the statement Ochel Tochel, it's a repetition of a verb. A lot of times we see a repetition of a verb, that is considered to be a positive mitzvah. Right? Okay, so the point is the fact that it is repeated seems to imply that there's some positive obligation on Adam and Chava to have eaten from all the fruit around them. So the Meshech Chachma says, okay, like this. Okay? Mikol Eitz Hagan Ochel Tochel, perish, hu mitzvah l'chachayot nafsho u'lachanot mipri Hagan. Okay? There's a mitzvah for the person to sustain themselves, to build up their base, and to have pleasure from all the fruits of the tree. Okay? And therefore he says over there, he says, a reference to a statement of the Rishalmi in the Sof of Kedushin Shlan, Atid Adam Litain Din V'cheshbon, on what they didn't do. Okay? So it seems to be, when you look at this, it's a very interesting idea. Now, the truth is Mesilas Yesharim says, what does that mean? Does it mean man's supposed to be hedonist? No, it means man has to make decisions of what is necessary for the individual's development and so forth and so forth. It's not every pleasure, but if you deny a pleasure that you really needed for your own health and your own, that's not good. But the point is what I think the Meshech Chachma is pointing out over there, is that the human being is created, and one of the directives on the human being is to advance the self. In terms of advancing the self, taking care of the self, and having the pleasure necessary in this world. In other words, there are normal things that a human being does. And once God created the human being, there is a perception that God wanted the human being to follow through on the human feelings that this person has. Okay? Doesn't mean everything, but it means that the fact is that there is some type of development of the human being. And we are created with that type of development. We're created with nature, with human nature. We're created with ideas. And the point is they're not there just to play games with. It's not just a game, hey, I created you the drive because I want to test you by you denying that drive. I created you the drive because human beings need this drive. And you are supposed to follow through using this drive in a way that's beneficial to yourself. Okay, there is some development of the human being in that regard. So the Meshech Chachma learns that out from Mikol Eitz Hagan Ochel Tochel. But in other words, generally, but there are limitations and parameters on it, and that's a parameter Me'etz Das Tov V'Ra Tochel. But don't eat from that one. In other words, you have to know your parameters, but generally you are following through on the development of your being. Now, what that seems to say, though, is that from our perspective, what the secularists say is human being wakes up and figures out, what do I want to do, and should have some freedoms and develop. In a certain way, it seems, according to Meshech Chachma, that Torah also believes that there's a benefit to the human being developing the self. Right? That the human being should develop the self. Okay? Now, those self should be developed within certain parameters. Those are the parameters of two forms of parameters. One are parameters from the world of rationalism, which is the parameters of rational morality, natural morality. And there's other parameters which comes from the world of revelation, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates certain other parameters for other reasons. Some of those parameters not really understandable, which creates the issue of why there are parameters upon our travel in this world that are not understandable. But the fact is that we now have a different perspective. The secular perspective is that there's no reason for an authority figure. Okay, we're brought up one day. There's this projection of authority figure. How do we know about this authority figure? How do we know if to listen to the authority figure? How do we know it's even true? And who says we can even know the truth? That seems to be the basis of secular freedom. From our perspective, from a Torah perspective, it seems to be that there actually is a creation of there is obviously an authority figure, a Kadosh Baruch Hu, but a Kadosh Baruch Hu created active human beings who were supposed to be entities that lived their lives. And therefore there are something within human beings that they are to follow through on. And these are supposed to be recognized and worked with. Okay, and therefore when we talk about the freedoms from a Torah perspective, we're talking about our own human feelings, our own human expressions that HaKadosh Baruch Hu seemed to have given us in order to live life. Okay, so it's not so the truth is that you talk in terms of freedom. The fact is we're saying, hey, we were given this drive, and there must be a purpose to this drive. And therefore, since there must be a purpose to this drive, the whatever authorities I must understand has to be involved in directing this drive, not just curtailing the drive. Okay, so that seems to be a opening statement in the sense that it seems, and by the way, there are people who would disagree with this idea. I'm quoting the Meshech Chacham, which I think defines this. There's an article I read by Professor Lawrence Kaplan on the distinction of Rav Moshe and the Chazon Ish. Rav Moshe, I think, would fall through in this idea. He says the Chazon Ish does not respect the concept of human nature. Like Rav Moshe held that in following Torah and mitzvahs, you will find a proper expression of human nature. In other words, a person could be happy. In other words, human nature, you're only happy if you satisfy human nature. So Rav Moshe, according to Rabbi Kaplan, it seems the Rav also, is that in a certain way, you would, it's possible for human beings to be happy because it's possible to find the expression of human nature within the parameters of Torah. In a general sense, he says that the Chazon Ish would not agree with that. Okay, so there may be other viewpoints, but it's clear. I think it's clear that there is one viewpoint within Torah that seems to imply that there is a value to human nature. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has placed human nature within us in order to be one of our guides in how to live, and that we are to follow through on these aspects of human nature, and that freedom is really just the allowance for the expression of human nature. And that is to be a balancing aspect of our being, recognizing that there's other parameters, social parameters, obligations to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and so forth, which does place parameters on our freedom, because we don't just live in a vacuum all by ourselves. The same way the secularists say there's a parameter on freedom because of the social contract. So we have other aspects of the parameter. But the idea that there's this kind of drive that the Torah is gerus as having value tells us that there's a reason to support the concept of following through on freedom. Okay, so we can ask the question all the time of if there is a limitation of Torah upon our being, we can ask the question of why there should be that type of limitation. And we actually can be involved in that type of conflict. So as I understand a lot of Shiloh's and Shuvah's form, they don't shy away from the fact that that's a Shiloh, and you have an idea that they would like to, that they'd like to be matter something, right? Classic example in Guna. Right? We like to be matter and a guna. The perception is we understand human nature. People want to be with someone. This is a very difficult situation. So we want to try and and find a way to this person to find some expression of self. The idea of finding expression of self is not necessarily a bad thing from a Torah perspective. So when we look for heterim, we basically say, hey, now this doesn't mean every heter in the world. Okay, it doesn't mean that we're hedonistic, but it means that, that we don't necessarily shy away from the fact that a person may want a heter. Okay, in other words, wanting a heter is not necessarily a bad thing, because that heter may reflect some expression of self. Okay, it's interesting. I wrote an article about this called heter, and emerged from a conversation that a person had. It was interesting. It was a conversation where this woman who was married for like 6 months, and she got a divorce, and she no longer wanted to cover her hair. Okay, while she was divorced, generally the prima facie halacha is that a woman who's divorced should still cover her hair. But the fact that she didn't want to cover her hair anymore because she felt she's only married for 6 months, it would affect her shidduchim, it would affect her the way she looks at herself. It would be a constant reminder of her failure, and so forth and so forth. So she spoke to a couple rabbanim about heterim. And she spoke to me about that and so forth. I didn't actually paskin, but I think I gave her the idea that she'd be able to find a heter. But she got a psak from a major posek that she didn't have to cover her hair anymore. Okay, the point is she's talking to one of her friends. And one of her friends, yeah, we know there's a heter, but that what you really want to do? Don't you really want to follow the law? And she was very upset by this. Like, the person was basically saying to her that, you should, like, heter, that's like an easy way out, And I argued with her that you missed the whole point of heterim. You don't really understand what a heter is about. Okay, what?
It becomes a law, and then you get a heter. That becomes a law.
Right, but more than that searching for a heter is not necessarily a negative thing.
No.
Okay, that the heter, in her case, reflected an aspect of her being. Okay, and the point is, what Rabbanim understood in terms of being sensitive to her situation was that in terms of her being, okay, if she was able to find an expression for her being, and a way of presenting herself in life, that would be great. There is an idea that it has to be a heter. It can't just be without any regard for Torah or mitzvahs. But the point is that that's why the Torah system is such that it respects the movements of individuals. So in that situation, I actually wrote a whole article on heter. I don't think it's on our website yet, but a whole article that really what a heter is about is really allowing for the proper expression of self. That there is something that we were given as human beings, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates us a certain way, and that we sometimes need that expression of our own freedoms, okay, within the system, and the system is garrisid and recognized it. At a certain point in time, when you have a heter, it's incorrect for you to be machmer. It's incorrect for you to not follow through because you're missing the whole point of certain things, because there'll be repercussions other ways. Okay, this is a proper way of expressing yourself, and you're going to put a limitation on expressing yourself. And a really good poskim understand when they give a heter, sometimes they'll give a heter and say, okay, want to do this for a certain amount of time because really it's something you should move beyond. Other times they give you a heter and say, and don't you dare be machmer. Is it appropriate for you to be machmer because you need this expression of self? And that's all aspects of certain recognition of what we call the freedoms. That in our being, there is an aspect of who we are that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has placed within us, that in His direction through the mitzvahs and stuff like that, He doesn't mean to destroy it and to quell it. He means to direct it, but it doesn't mean to destroy and to quell it. Okay, and that's a major distinction, let's say, from other religious perspectives. When you start talking in terms of asceticism and stuff like that, the whole point is one of the authority structure basically coming down and not recognizing your autonomy and your being whatsoever. Okay? Our authority structure, in creating that autonomy, also says that we have a value in that autonomy. Okay, we have a value in that expression. It has to be directed in a proper way, but the authority structure recognizes the value in your being. So that's the first level of understanding the freedoms, that the Torah does recognize the freedoms, and that's really what the Meshech Chacham is saying in terms of the the fact is you're supposed to go out there and enjoy life. That's what human beings are about. That's part of the thing. Not in a totally hedonistic way, but who you are. You should be a person that reflects your personality. Okay? Okay. It's not supposed to be just about being totally limited. Okay, so that's the first step in understanding freedom of religion. There's something within Torah that respects the aspect of freedom of religion, or aspects, I should say, of freedoms. Okay? The seculars, as I said, they have this aspect of freedoms because it starts with no perception of the authority figure, and then it challenges the idea of the authority figure, i.e., the religious entities, as who says it's true. That's not the way it works within Torah, obviously. There has to be a sense of there's some aspects of reflection of self, but when you start getting into issues of freedom of religion, you're obviously saying that somehow I can challenge even some authority decisions. So constantly we can question ourselves whether our understandings is correct or not. And the very fact that you have the Shivim Panim B'Torah and so forth in the Torah perspective can lead up the idea of recognizing that we make decisions what we think Kosh Baruch Hu is telling us, and therefore we have to recognize that our decisions are come from ourselves. Therefore we can look at ourselves to see whether we are correct in our perceptions of what Kosh Baruch Hu is telling us, and we can always open up things to further analysis. But there's a further step. And another step is that from the secular perspective, freedom of religion emerges from the idea that we can't know the truth. From a Torah perspective, freedom of religion doesn't emerge from the fact that we can't know the truth. It's from the recognition of the challenge of knowing the truth. In our world today, when we have the concept of Kodesh Baruch Hu being Hester Panim, hiding his face, the reality is the truth is not so clear-cut to us. Okay, so therefore, we know about ourselves, we know about our being. The truth is not something that we really fully know about. And that's something we have to begin to recognize. Therefore, we have to question, this is something that most people don't recognize, is that the idea of emunah shalema, of true faith, the person say, I believe totally, right? What people don't recognize is that statement is not a statement about the strength of belief in God. It's a statement about the ego. A person who says, I believe absolutely true that this is the truth, what that person is really saying is something about their own ego. That I think I know what I'm talking about. Right? And the fact is that person does not take on the challenge of hearing other people's statements and thinking that my total belief is an indication that I can totally ignore anyone else's challenges. What you're really talking about is a very limited ego in that individual. I'm right, everyone else is wrong. Okay? And the fact is, from a Torah's perspective, we have the concept of Theonias Daiti. We always see from people in the challenge of Theonias Daiti. I don't know. This is my conclusion now. We're supposed to follow through on our conclusions. We have a responsibility to follow through on our conclusions. But there's always that sense of saying, you know something? It's a Theonias Daiti. I understand the limitations of my own thought process. Now, I have to follow my own thought process because I have nothing else. Robert Frost made a statement once that courage is the ability to make decisions with insufficient information. In a certain way, we all have that challenge. But the point is that we have to follow through in that challenge. Right? We have to make decisions. Whatever we do, we have to make decisions. But the point is that there's a difference between making decisions in a totally egotistical way or making decisions with confidence, but recognizing the limitations of our own decision making. And that's the next step. In other words, that's the first step. The first step is that the Torah recognizes a value in the human being and their perspectives. The second step is the Torah recognizes not that it's impossible to know the truth. It recognizes within our present world that it is a challenge to know the truth. And therefore, we can respect an individual who's going through that challenge. Okay? And what I'm going to do next week is I'm going to build upon a Gemara in Shabbos that seems to make this point, where Hillel basically points out to an individual that someone who denies certain aspects of Torah is not a kofar, he's not a heretic. He's just simply someone who doesn't believe, and he recognizes the fact that doubt is not necessarily a negative thing. Doubt is a normative state for someone in the process of study and the process of acquiring truth. Okay. If you don't have any questions, how are you going to go further? And the fact is that's a unique aspect of what I think is the Torah view of freedom of religion, in the sense that we hypothesize or we postulate that individuals have a responsibility to determine what the truth is and to follow through on decision makings due to that. However, we also recognize the challenge of that reality. So we have the idea that we do have a sense of our own being within Torah, and we also have a recognition not that the truth is impossible to know, but the truth is a challenge to know. Therefore, we can live with the Torah can live with the reality of people having difficulties in making that decision, which results in the issues of freedom of religion and the fact that in a certain way the Torah respects a freedom of religion in the sense of the individual in the struggle of trying to know the truth and trying to make the right decision, sometimes making the incorrect decision. We will acknowledge that, or we will recognize that as a possibility that's not even culpable. Okay? So that's where we're going to go next week.